It took nearly a year for complete paralysis to travel from the tips of a man's toes to the major muscles of his chest. The cause of this profound neurological collapse was eventually found resting quietly on his bathroom sink, hidden inside an ordinary plastic tube purchased from a local pharmacy for less than $4. This is one of two clinical cases examined tonight, tracing the diagnostic path from subtle physical changes to their deeply hidden origins. Both records document the quiet, systemic unraveling that occurs when the human body encounters a silent disruption. There is no need to stay awake to hear the final resolution of these medical histories. You are free to follow the steady progression of symptoms for only as long as you like, letting the clinical details blur and fade as you drift toward sleep. The cadence will remain even and quiet, with nothing ahead to startle you. The golden ring of madness. The presentation began as a slow, quiet unraveling over the course of about 8 months. The patient, a young woman in her early 20s, had been managing the ordinary pressures of university life when her family first noticed a shift in her demeanor. It was not sudden. It started as a vague, persistent anxiety. She became withdrawn, spending long hours in her room, and stopped returning calls. Soon, the anxiety sharpened into profound paranoia. She became convinced that the water in her apartment building was contaminated, refusing to drink from the tap and eventually distrusting bottled water as well. She began to believe that her neighbors were monitoring her movements through the walls. Alongside the growing fear, a strange physical clumsiness settled over her. She had always been coordinated, but now she found herself dropping her keys and fumbling with buttons. A fine, continuous tremor developed in her hands. When she tried to hold a cup of tea or write with a pen, the shaking would worsen, becoming a rhythmic trembling that she could not suppress no matter how hard she focused. Her family, deeply concerned by her escalating fear and her physical decline, brought her to a psychiatric clinic for an evaluation. In the examination room, she sat rigidly in her chair. She avoided eye contact, staring downward at her hands, which rested in her lap and vibrated with a slight, involuntary tremor. Her face lacked its usual mobility of expression, a presentation often described as a flat affect. When the physician asked her questions, her speech was slow and slightly slurred, as if the muscles of her jaw and tongue were not fully cooperating. Her limbs felt stiff when the doctor gently moved her arms to test her reflexes. She appeared exhausted, worn down by the constant weight of her delusions. Based on this initial presentation, the medical team arrived at a preliminary diagnosis of early-onset schizophrenia. It was a perfectly reasonable conclusion, heavily supported by the clinical evidence at hand. Schizophrenia is a complex psychiatric condition that often first emerges exactly at this stage of life, in the late teens or early 20s. It involves a disruption in the way the brain processes information and perceives reality, frequently leading to the kind of intense paranoia and delusions the young woman was experiencing. Even her physical symptoms seemed to fit seamlessly within this framework. While schizophrenia is primarily known for altering thought and perception, it can also deeply affect the motor system, the network of nerves and muscles that controls movement. Patients experiencing severe psychiatric distress can sometimes develop catatonia, a state where the muscles become rigid and movement slows down or stops entirely. Furthermore, the extreme anxiety and the biological stress of an active psychotic episode can easily cause tremors and a lack of physical coordination. To the evaluating physicians, the stiffness in her limbs, the blankness in her expression, and her pervasive paranoia all pointed steadily toward a primary psychiatric illness. She was admitted to the ward for care and observation. As part of a standard admission process, a routine panel of blood tests was drawn just to ensure there were no underlying infections or obvious chemical imbalances that might be contributing to her altered state. When the results returned from the laboratory, almost everything was perfectly normal. Her kidney function was fine, her blood counts were healthy, and her essential minerals were balanced. There was, however, one minor anomaly. Two markers of liver health, specific proteins known as liver enzymes, were slightly elevated. These enzymes normally live inside liver cells, doing the daily work of breaking down nutrients and clearing out waste. When liver cells are irritated or damaged, they break open and spill these enzymes into the bloodstream. The elevation in her blood was mild, hardly enough to cause immediate alarm in a busy hospital, yet it remained a quiet, lingering inconsistency in a young woman with a supposedly psychiatric condition. To a busy physician on a psychiatric ward, slightly elevated liver enzymes are often attributed to the stress of a severe mental health episode, poor nutrition, or the physiological strain of a changing environment. It would have been easy to simply note the finding in her chart and move on. However, the medical team reviewing her case found themselves troubled by the sheer suddenness of her physical and mental decline. A healthy young person does not typically develop rigid limbs and profound paranoia overnight without some underlying physical catalyst. The minor anomaly in her liver function tests was the only tangible clue they had, a loose thread in an otherwise perfectly normal medical chart. They decided to pull on that thread, ordering a comprehensive panel of tests designed to look at the body's metabolic function, including how it processes heavy metals and trace elements. To understand what they were looking for, it is helpful to look at how the human body manages the resources it takes in from the outside world. We often think of metals like iron, zinc, and copper as materials for industry, used to build bridges or wire our homes. But these same metals in microscopic amounts are absolutely essential for human life. Copper in particular plays a vital role in our daily survival. We consume it regularly, usually without ever thinking about it. It is found in abundance in everyday foods like whole grains, nuts, seeds, dark chocolate, and shellfish. Once ingested, this dietary copper travels down into the stomach and enters the small intestine, where it is absorbed through the intestinal walls and into the bloodstream. From the intestines, the newly absorbed copper does not simply float freely through the body. It is carried directly to the liver. The liver acts as the body's great chemical processing plant, a sprawling sorting facility that filters everything we consume. When copper arrives at the liver, it is taken up by the liver cells, which function as diligent workers managing the flow of supplies. The liver has a delicate task when it comes to copper. While the body desperately needs this metal to build healthy connective tissues, maintain the nervous system, and generate energy inside our cells, copper is also inherently dangerous if left unmanaged. In its raw, unbound state, copper is highly reactive. If it is allowed to interact freely with the delicate internal structures of a cell, it creates a chemical reaction similar to rust forming on a piece of iron left out in the rain. This biological rusting process damages the cell from the inside out. Because of this danger, the liver must handle copper with the utmost care, much like a person handling a glowing, hot coal. It cannot simply be held or tossed around. It must be placed in a safe, insulated container. The liver cells manufacture a specific protective protein whose sole purpose is to act as this safe container for copper. The protein wraps around the metal, shielding its reactive edges, and securely escorts it back into the bloodstream so it can be safely delivered to the muscles, the brain, and the bones where it is needed. This careful packaging system ensures that the copper can do its vital work without causing any cellular damage along the way. But the body only needs a very small amount of copper each day, and we almost always consume more than we require. The liver must therefore dispose of the excess. To do this, the liver cells rely on a specialized piece of microscopic machinery, a tiny protein pump located on the cell wall. The only job of this pump is to push the leftover, unneeded copper out of the liver cell and into the bile ducts. Bile is a thick, yellow-green fluid that the liver produces to help with digestion. As the excess copper is pumped into the bile, it flows gently out of the liver, into the intestines, and is eventually carried out of the body entirely as waste. In a healthy person, this elegant system of absorption, packaging, and disposal runs seamlessly day and night, keeping the body's copper levels in a state of perfect balance. In this young woman's case, however, the system harbored a silent flaw. She had been born with a rare, inherited misprint in her genetic code. This specific genetic error contained the instructions for building the tiny protein pump that is supposed to push excess copper into the bile. Because the instructions were incorrect, the pumps on her liver cells were built with the wrong shape, rendering them completely unable to do their job. For the first 2 decades of her life, this microscopic failure caused no noticeable problems. She ate normal meals, absorbing small amounts of copper every day. The copper traveled to her liver, and her liver cells packaged what the body needed. But when it came time to throw away the extra copper, the broken pump simply could not move the metal into the bile. With the exit door firmly shut, the excess copper had nowhere to go. It remained trapped inside the liver cells. Day after day, year after year, the copper slowly accumulated. For a long time, the liver managed to store this dangerous excess, hiding it away in internal compartments to protect the rest of the body. But a liver cell can only hold so much raw, reactive metal before the biological rusting process begins to take its toll. The hot coals eventually burned through their containers. Slowly, the liver cells began to experience significant internal damage. As the cells became sick, their outer walls weakened, and they occasionally broke open, spilling their contents into the surrounding blood. This slow, microscopic injury to the liver was the exact mechanism that caused those specific liver enzymes to leak into her bloodstream, creating the minor elevation that the hospital laboratory had detected on her first day of admission. Eventually, her liver became completely saturated, unable to safely package or store even one more microscopic flake of copper. The protective system failed entirely. The liver had reached its absolute capacity. With nowhere else to put the steady daily influx of dietary copper, the liver began to dump it directly into the bloodstream in its raw, toxic, unbound form. This free-floating copper was carried away by the rushing currents of her circulatory system, traveling far beyond the liver. Without its protective protein escort, the reactive metal was free to settle in other tissues throughout her body, slowly poisoning the cells from within. And while toxic copper can accumulate in many places, it has a particular affinity for settling in 2 specific areas: the clear tissues of the eye and the deep, intricate structures of the brain. As the unfiltered blood traveled upward into her skull, the unbound copper slipped through the cellular barriers that normally protect the brain from toxins. It began to pool heavily in the basal ganglia, a cluster of nerve cells nestled deep within the center of the brain. The basal ganglia function as the brain's control center for both physical movement and the regulation of mood and behavior. When we want to walk smoothly across a room, or when we process the emotional weight of a situation, we are relying on these deep brain structures to send clear, uninterrupted electrical signals. As the raw copper settled into the basal ganglia, it began to rust and damage these delicate nerve pathways. The electrical signals governing her muscles became scrambled and erratic, leading directly to the stiffness in her limbs, the loss of expression on her face, and the involuntary tremors that her doctors had noted. Simultaneously, the copper was disrupting the chemical networks that maintained her emotional stability. The brain's ability to filter reality and maintain a sense of calm was gradually dismantled by the heavy metal toxicity, plunging her into the terrifying depths of paranoia and altered reality that had brought her to the psychiatric ward in the first place. Her entire presentation, a bewildering mix of physical rigidity and mental unraveling, was not a primary psychiatric illness at all. It was the result of her own brain slowly corroding under the weight of a common dietary mineral. The medical team was beginning to piece together this intricate physiological puzzle, waiting on the specialized blood tests that would measure the amount of free copper and protective proteins in her circulation. But they would not have to wait long for the laboratory to confirm their suspicions. The heavy metal flowing through her body had already left a visible mark, resting quietly in a place where it could be seen with the naked eye, if only someone knew exactly where to look. The consultation room was dimly lit as the ophthalmologist asked the young woman to rest her chin on a specialized microscope called a slit lamp. This instrument shines a thin, intense beam of light into the eye, allowing a doctor to see the transparent layers of the tissue in deep cross-section. As the narrow beam swept across her eye, it illuminated something extraordinary at the very outer edge of her cornea, where the clear dome meets the white of the eye. Encircling the colored iris was a distinct, gleaming band of golden brown. It looked like a delicate ring of brushed copper suspended within the tissue itself. This was a Kaiserfleischer ring, a rare and unmistakable hallmark of heavy metal accumulation. The copper that was overwhelming her liver and irritating her brain had also been slowly depositing out of her circulation, settling quietly into the protective membrane of her eye. The presence of these golden rings provided the final, definitive piece of the puzzle. The young woman was diagnosed with Wilson's disease, a rare genetic disorder where the body loses its natural ability to process and eliminate copper. The blood tests soon returned from the laboratory, confirming what the glowing rings had already announced. Her levels of ceruloplasmin, a specialized protein that normally acts like a protective escort carrying copper safely through the bloodstream, were unusually low. Without enough of these escort proteins, the copper was left to wander freely. Furthermore, a test collecting her urine over a full 24 hours showed massive amounts of copper being expelled, as her kidneys desperately tried to filter out the toxic overflow that her liver could no longer manage. Normally, the liver acts as the body's central processing plant. When we consume copper from everyday foods like nuts or beans, the liver uses what it needs for basic cellular functions and then neatly packages the rest into a digestive fluid called bile, which is then flushed out of the body. In Wilson's disease, a single genetic misspelling breaks a crucial cellular pump within the liver. The organ can still take copper in, but it can no longer pump the excess out. Over the years, the metal builds up inside the liver cells until they swell and fail, releasing unbound, highly reactive copper into the general blood supply. From there, it seeks out organs that require a lot of energy, migrating steadily into the soft tissues of the brain and the eye. With the mystery finally solved, her doctors could shift from managing an assumed psychiatric crisis to treating a precise biochemical flaw. The treatment relies on removing the accumulated metal and preventing new copper from taking its place. She was started on a type of medication known as a chelating agent. The word chelation comes from the Greek word for claw, which describes perfectly how the medication works. As the drug circulates, its molecules act like tiny chemical claws, tightly grasping the free copper floating in the bloodstream. Once the copper is trapped in this chemical grip, it becomes water-soluble and is safely washed out of the body through the urine. The process had to be done carefully and gradually, ensuring the heavy metal did not cause further irritation to her nervous system on its way out. In addition to the chelating agent, she was given zinc supplements, which act as a gentle blockade in the digestive tract. Zinc prompts the cells lining the stomach to produce a special protein that binds to copper in her food, trapping the metal in the gut so it passes harmlessly out of the body rather than entering her bloodstream. Slowly, over the course of several months, the toxic tide began to recede. As the copper was washed away from the deep structures of her brain, her physical rigidity softened. Her limbs regained their natural movement, and the tremors quietly faded. More profoundly, as the chemical irritation in her neural network subsided, the terrifying veil of paranoia lifted. The hallucinations dissolved entirely, revealing the calm, lucid young woman beneath the biochemical static. The golden rings around her corneas eventually faded, leaving behind clear eyes and a restored mind. Though she would need maintenance medication for life to manage her copper levels, she returned fully to her normal routines, free of the shadows that had nearly claimed her. Cases like this offer a profound reminder that the boundary we draw between psychiatry and biology is highly porous, and a complete diagnostic process must always respect how deeply intertwined our physical chemistry is with our mental reality. When doctors are faced with a sudden, uncharacteristic unraveling of a patient's mind, true diagnosis requires looking past the most disruptive behavioral symptoms to investigate the entire physiological system. It teaches us that human behavior is tethered to cellular health, where a simple overflow of an ordinary dietary mineral can completely rewrite a person's perception of the world. Ultimately, the answer to a seemingly intractable psychological crisis was not found by analyzing the mind, but by illuminating a quiet, physical clue suspended in the clear edge of the eye. The paralyzing paste. It began as a faint, persistent tingling in the toes, something that was easy enough to dismiss at first as poor circulation or merely a consequence of getting older. For a gentleman in his late 60s, a little numbness was hardly cause for alarm. It felt as though he were wearing thick woolen socks, even when his feet were bare. Over the course of several months, this muffled sensation crept slowly upward, passing the ankles and settling into the calves. It was a gradual but relentless progression. Soon, the tingling shifted into a deeper numbness, accompanied by occasional, fleeting sensations of sharp nerve pain, resembling the crackle of static electricity just beneath the skin. The most challenging development, however, was in his ability to walk. He found himself stumbling on flat, even carpets. When he closed his eyes in the shower to rinse his hair, he felt a sudden, disorienting sway, as if the floor had quietly tilted beneath him. This was a loss of proprioception, the body's hidden spatial sense. Proprioception is the constant, silent conversation between the nerves in the joints and the brain, a mechanism that tells you exactly where your limbs are in space without needing to look at them. Without this continuous stream of sensory information, his feet felt entirely disconnected from his mind. He had to look down at his shoes to ensure they were actually striking the ground. Eventually, he began to rely on a sturdy wooden cane simply to cross the living room safely. By the time he was seated in the neurologist's examination room, walking had become a slow, wide-stanced effort. The initial physical examination revealed a clear pattern of neurological wear. When the physician struck a metallic tuning fork and placed the vibrating base against the patient's ankle bone, the man felt only a cool pressure, completely unaware of the subtle, humming vibration. The reflexes in his knees and ankles were also unusually brisk. Typically, when a doctor taps the knee with a rubber hammer, the leg gives a mild, controlled kick. In this patient, the leg jerked forward quite forcefully. This kind of exaggerated response often occurs when there is interference in the spinal cord. The brain normally sends a continuous, calming signal down the spine to keep reflexes in check. When the spinal pathways are frayed, that braking system is lost and the reflexes become hyperactive. Taking into account the progressive weakness, the ascending numbness, and the hyperactive reflexes, the initial diagnosis leaned toward an irreversible, degenerative disease of the nervous system. The most prominent consideration was amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, commonly known as ALS, or a similarly progressive disorder of the spinal cord. It is a diagnosis that suggests a steady, inevitable fading of nerve function over time. This conclusion was drawn carefully, based on a solid foundation of clinical evidence. The patient's symptoms were bilateral, affecting both sides of the body equally, which pointed away from localized issues like a single pinched nerve. The progression was slow and steady, without the sudden onset that might suggest a stroke. Furthermore, initial blood tests ruled out the most common reversible causes of spinal cord damage. His vitamin B12 levels were perfectly normal, and there were no signs of diabetes, thyroid dysfunction, or exposure to heavy metals like lead. The clinical picture neatly matched a degenerative disease where the long nerve fibers traveling down the spinal cord gradually lose their protective insulation and slowly wither away. Yet nestled within the pages of the patient's routine laboratory results was a quiet, unassuming anomaly. A standard blood count showed that the patient had mild anemia, meaning he had a lower than normal number of red blood cells. Alongside this, his white blood cell count was also mysteriously depressed. ALS and similar degenerative nerve diseases are strictly confined to the nervous system. They wear down the pathways of the brain and spinal cord, but they have no effect whatsoever on the bone marrow, where blood cells are manufactured. The patient's nerves were failing, which fit the primary diagnosis perfectly, but his blood was also failing to replenish itself, leaving a gentle contradiction sitting quietly on the laboratory page. To resolve such a gentle contradiction in medicine, physicians often look for a shared foundation. When two entirely distinct systems in the body begin to fail at the same time, in this case, the bone marrow quietly halting its production of blood cells, and the long nerves of the spinal cord slowly losing their ability to carry signals, the search shifts away from a disease that targets just one organ. Instead, it turns toward the fundamental building blocks that both systems require to survive. The doctors began to wonder if the patient was experiencing a subtle, profound starvation of a single, essential nutrient. The human body is built from familiar elements like carbon, oxygen, and calcium, but it also relies on a delicate machinery powered by trace metals. These metals are needed in remarkably small quantities, yet they are absolutely critical for life. One of the most important is copper. While we might think of this metal mostly in the context of electrical wiring or old plumbing, dissolved copper ions are incorporated into the deepest, most intricate structures of our own cells. Take, for example, the bone marrow. Deep inside the center of the body's long bones, such as the femur and the pelvis, sits a dark, spongy factory. This factory constantly manufactures red blood cells to carry oxygen and white blood cells to defend against illness, operating as an assembly line that turns out millions of new cells every second to replace the ones that age and fade away. But this assembly line cannot function without copper. In the bone marrow, copper acts as a necessary component for the cellular machinery that handles iron. To build a red blood cell, the marrow must load iron into a protein called hemoglobin, which is the molecule that actually holds onto oxygen. Copper sits at the center of a specialized enzyme that acts much like a microscopic loading crane, shifting iron into the correct position so it can be utilized. If copper is missing, the crane stops working. Iron may be plentiful in the body, but without copper, it cannot be loaded into the red blood cells. The assembly line slows to a crawl. The total number of red blood cells drops, resulting in the mild anemia seen on the patient's laboratory tests. Similarly, the pathways that mature and release white blood cells rely on copper-dependent enzymes to maintain their structure. Without the metal, white blood cell production quietly falters. The nervous system relies on copper in an equally vital, though entirely different, manner. The nerves traveling down the spinal cord are some of the longest single cells in the human body, stretching from the lower spine all the way down the leg to the toes, carrying electrical impulses across vast cellular distances. To ensure these electrical signals travel swiftly and do not leak out into the surrounding tissue, the nerve fibers are wrapped in a thick, fatty coating known as myelin. This myelin sheath functions exactly like the rubber insulation encasing an electrical cord. Maintaining this insulation requires constant, daily upkeep. The cells must continuously sweep away metabolic waste and patch any microscopic wear and tear along the length of the nerve. Copper is the essential key for the enzymes that manage this maintenance. It helps run the tiny energy-generating structures inside the nerve cells, and it powers the proteins that clear away damaging byproducts of cellular metabolism. Without a steady supply of copper, the maintenance crew essentially walks off the job. The protective myelin insulation slowly begins to degrade and strip away, leaving the bare nerve fibers exposed. Once exposed, the electrical signals misfire, scatter, or fail to reach their destination altogether. Over time, the fragile nerve fibers themselves, left without their protective sheath, begin to wither and die back. To the doctors examining the patient, this gradual dying back of the spinal nerves looked exactly like a degenerative disease such as ALS. The numbness, the tingling, the progressive weakness in the legs, and the eventual inability to walk were all the direct result of the long nerves losing their insulation and failing. The patient's failing blood and his failing nerves were not two separate problems. They were the exact same problem, manifesting in different parts of the body. He was suffering from a profound, systemic lack of copper, but recognizing the lack of copper only deepened the mystery because copper is readily available in an everyday diet. It is found in abundance in nuts, seeds, whole grains, and meats. The patient was eating normally, so the mineral should have been easily absorbed. To understand why his body was starving in the midst of plenty, one must look at the microscopic gateway where the outside world meets the inside of the body, the lining of the small intestine. When food is broken down in the stomach and passes into the small intestine, dissolved nutrients are absorbed by a single, delicate layer of specialized lining cells. These cells act as border guards. They decide what is allowed to enter the bloodstream and what must be left behind to pass out of the body. Because trace metals can be dangerous if allowed to build up to high levels, the intestinal lining cells carefully regulate their passage. This regulatory system involves a careful balancing act between different metals, particularly between copper and another essential trace mineral, zinc. Zinc is also vital for the immune system and cellular repair, and it travels through the exact same microscopic doorways in the intestinal lining that copper uses. To manage the flow of these metals, the lining cells manufacture a specialized holding protein. This protein acts like a chemical sponge, designed to bind to heavy metals and keep them from flooding the bloodstream all at once. When a person consumes a large amount of zinc, the intestinal cells sense the incoming tide and react by producing massive quantities of this sponge-like holding protein, intending to capture the excess zinc and protect the body. Here lies the precise microscopic vulnerability dismantling the patient's life. This holding protein has a structural quirk. It is far more magnetically attracted to copper than it is to zinc. It binds to copper with a chemical grip that is thousands of times stronger. If a person's digestive tract is continually flooded with extraordinarily high, unnatural levels of zinc, the intestinal lining cells become packed with vast amounts of the holding protein. As normal amounts of dietary copper enter the intestine, this overabundant protein sponge snaps it all up. Every single molecule of copper that the patient ate was immediately trapped inside the cells of the intestinal wall, securely locked away by the very protein that was supposed to be managing zinc. The trapped copper is held in a sort of cellular purgatory. It cannot move forward into the bloodstream, where the bone marrow and the spinal cord so desperately need it. But it also does not wash away. Instead, it quietly waits inside the lining cells. The lining of the human intestine is temporary by design. The environment of digestion is harsh, so the body sheds these surface cells every few days, replacing them with a fresh layer underneath. When those old intestinal cells naturally detach and fall away, they carry the trapped copper with them out into the digestive tract, where it is finally expelled from the body entirely. The mechanism is an elegant defense against zinc toxicity, but when pushed to the extreme, it creates an absolute blockade against copper. Day after day, month after month, the patient was absorbing practically zero copper. His liver stores eventually ran dry, then the blood levels dropped. Without the metal to run the loading cranes, his bone marrow slowed its production of red and white blood cells, creating the quiet anomaly on his laboratory charts. Without the metal to fuel the cellular maintenance crews, the insulation on his spinal nerves degraded, leaving him paralyzed and in pain. When the medical team finally ordered a specific blood panel to check his trace mineral levels, the results painted a stark and undeniable picture of this physiological cascade. The copper in his blood was virtually undetectable, starved out of existence. Meanwhile, his zinc levels were astronomical, far beyond the highest limits of normal. The underlying mechanics of his illness were finally clear, pulling the grim diagnosis of an incurable spinal disease off the table. He did not have a degenerative nerve condition. He was being systematically stripped of a vital nutrient by an overwhelming flood of zinc. The investigation now pivoted away from his internal physiology and toward his daily life, presenting the doctors with a completely new puzzle. To save his nerves and reverse the damage, they had to figure out where such a massive, unnatural quantity of zinc was coming from. The search for the source of the heavy metal began with the most common culprits. The medical team asked about dietary supplements, vitamins, and the various lozenges or nasal sprays often used to ward off winter colds, as these frequently contain concentrated amounts of zinc. They asked about his work history, wondering if he had spent decades breathing in metal fumes as a welder or a pipefitter. They even questioned the type of pipes in his home and the cookware in his kitchen. The answers were uniformly negative. He took no supplements, worked a standard indoor job, and lived in an ordinary suburban home. To find the answer, the physicians had to conduct a painstaking inventory of his daily routine, mentally walking through his day from the moment he woke up to the moment he went asleep. The breakthrough happened when the conversation turned to the very beginning of his morning, standing in front of the bathroom mirror. Years earlier, the man had been fitted for dentures. Over time, as his jaw naturally changed shape with age, the artificial teeth had grown loose and uncomfortable. Rather than going back to the dentist for an expensive realignment, he had relied on over-the-counter denture adhesive to keep them securely in place. Because the fit was so poor, a thin layer of the paste was no longer enough. He had begun applying it in thick, heavy ribbons, using so much that the excess would ooze onto his palate and eventually be swallowed over the course of the day. A single tube of this adhesive was meant to last a month or more, but he was routinely finishing several tubes every week. As the doctors examined the specific brand of paste he favored, the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. The adhesive relied on zinc as a stabilizing agent to enhance its grip. Every time he secured his teeth, he was inadvertently swallowing a massive dose of the metal. The formal diagnosis was zinc-induced copper deficiency, a condition where an overabundance of one essential mineral essentially starves the body of another. The mechanism behind this starvation occurs entirely within the lining of the digestive tract. When the human stomach and intestines are flooded with zinc, the cells lining the gut react by producing a specific protein to help manage the influx. This protein acts like a microscopic sponge, designed to bind to heavy metals. However, this biological sponge has a strong preference for copper. It will bind to copper much more readily and tightly than it will to zinc. As the man digested his meals, the protein sponges in his intestinal wall eagerly gathered up every trace of copper from his food. Instead of passing into his bloodstream to nourish his nerves and bone marrow, the copper remained trapped within the cells of the gut lining. Human intestinal cells have a very short lifespan, naturally shedding every few days to be replaced by new ones. As these cells shed, the trapped copper was carried away with them and excreted from the body. The overwhelming daily tide of zinc from the denture paste had effectively built an impenetrable wall in his gut, blocking any copper from entering his system. The treatment for this profound deficiency was remarkably straightforward, requiring no complex surgeries or experimental therapies. The very first step was simply throwing the denture adhesive in the trash. To bypass his blocked digestive system, the medical team administered copper directly into his veins, later transitioning to oral supplements once the lingering zinc had cleared from his gut. His recovery occurred in two distinct phases. The changes in his blood were rapid and highly satisfying. Within a matter of weeks, his bone marrow resumed its normal, healthy rhythm. His anemia resolved, his white blood cell count returned to a safe level, and the overwhelming fatigue began to lift. The neurological recovery, however, was incomplete. The severe degradation of the insulating sheath around his spinal nerves had left permanent scars. He did not regain the full use of his legs, and he continued to rely on a walker to navigate his home. There was still a lingering numbness in his hands and feet, a quiet echo of the damage that had been done. Yet the terrifying progression of his illness halted completely. The severe electric nerve pain faded away into a dull memory, and he was no longer facing the grim, inevitably fatal decline of a degenerative spinal disease. His condition was stabilized and his life was given back to him, altered but secure. There is a profound lesson in this sequence of events regarding the true nature of medical diagnosis. It demonstrates that the answers to the most devastating physiological breakdowns do not always lie in rare genetic mutations or exotic pathogens. Frequently, the deepest medical mysteries are solved by looking closely at the perfectly ordinary objects sitting quietly on a bathroom sink. Diagnosis is ultimately a bridge between the incredibly complex microscopic world of human biology and the mundane, everyday habits that make up a life. That's where we'll leave it tonight. Sleep well.